Ready to get started? Chemistry and agriculture, the phosphorus cycle, and the carbon cycle. These are very important topics, especially the carbon cycle. This is our last session. All of the 8 sessions will be sent to you. And then we have about 274 people who've signed up to receive the content of these presentations. And so all of this will be on YouTube for all of these 274 people. They will have access to the recordings. And it'll all be on YouTube, and Kelly will inform everybody by email about that status. These are live streams, so we do some editing and clean everything up for the before we load it onto YouTube. Next. So Kelly, just click your screen. Phosphate rock. This is the story of the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus is an element. It's found in molecular structures called phosphate. Phosphate rock commonly occurs around the planet. Next slide. And as mentioned, it is a rock. It comes as a red phosphorus or white phosphorus. Red phosphorus is the most common one. But both of them occur in phosphate deposits around the planet. Go to the next slide. This is what a phosphate mine looks like. This is in Morocco. Nice blue skies there. And these phosphate mines, you can see the red phosphate there and the white colored phosphates. There's also probably calcium in these deposits. And these deposits occur all over the planet. They are ancient seabeds that have been pushed up because of tectonic pressure, tectonic forces with the plates of the earth, the terrestrial plates that are sliding against each other. These are tectonic plates. The tectonic plates are both terrestrial and aquatic. They're in the oceans, they're on the land, they push over millions of years, they push these ancient seabeds up to the surface, and they actually become hills and mountains. Next slide. So the distribution of phosphate around the globe, this is a brief summary of that. You'll see that Morocco is number 1. The largest phosphate deposits are in the country of Morocco. And these numbers represent each unit of 100 million tons. So the volume of phosphate deposit in Morocco is really huge. But you can see that phosphate deposits are spread across a band there: United States, Morocco, several in North Africa, the Middle East, and then China, Russia, Kazakhstan. Even Australia has some deposits. But most of Africa does not have deposits. Most of Latin America is relatively poor in phosphate deposits. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. How does phosphate form? Phosphate rock deposits can be sedimentary or igneous, but more than 80% of the world's current production of phosphate rock is mined from sedimentary deposits formed by deposition of phosphate-rich materials in marine environments. This is especially the oceans of the world and the salt-based seas of the world, where where these deposits are continuously taking place. Next slide. Phosphate is a macronutrient. Now, in this case, we're talking about a macronutrient for plants, but phosphate is important in both animal and plant physiology. So phosphate is a macronutrient and the naturally occurring form of the element phosphorus, found in many phosphate minerals. Common fertilizers contain rock phosphate, treated with acid to make it more soluble and easily used by plants. Phosphate rock or phosphorock is an ore. It's a mined ore. It's the raw material that contains the element phosphorus. Okay, move on. Next slide. Now let's talk about the element phosphorus, which is embedded in phosphate molecules. So the element phosphorus is a chemical element with the symbol P and atomic number 15. Phosphorus is an element essential to sustaining life largely through phosphates. Phosphates are a component of DNA, RNA, ATP. ATP is the energy transfer molecule that's present in animals and plants, and part of the physiology or the metabolic system of animals and plants. And phospholipids, complex compounds fundamental to cells, both animal and plant cells. The vast majority of phosphorus compounds mined are consumed as fertilizers. Phosphate is needed to replace the phosphorus that plants remove from the soil, and its annual demand is rising nearly twice as fast as the growth of the human population. This is a very critical point. It's important to the field of agriculture, obviously, and I'm going to repeat it. The annual demand for phosphorus is rising nearly twice as fast as the growth of the human population. So this is obviously related to feeding people and animals on the planet. And as we expand the availability of food materials and feed materials, as well as fiber availability on the planet, that expansion, as you can see, is creating a demand for phosphorus or phosphate rock at twice the rate that the rate of growth of the human population on the planet. So this demand is putting a lot of pressure on phosphate deposits all over the planet. As such, these deposits it's now predicted may not survive into the future. We may run out of phosphate in 100 years. We're going to reach what's called phosphate peaks, where the demand for phosphate is growing so fast that their ability to keep up with it is not good. Peak means peak availability of phosphate, and we're probably already reaching that point. There's a lot of reporting in the world of agriculture that phosphate peaks are already with us today, and the cost of phosphate will go up. The distribution of phosphate will be limited around the planet. Agriculture will probably suffer from this, and we do need some alternative thinking with regard to how to better use phosphate rock or phosphorus in agricultural systems. One of the ways of doing that is to use microbiology, where the microbes very actively secrete biochemicals that mobilize insoluble phosphate molecules in the soil. break them down to plant available forms of phosphate, ultimately phosphorus forms that can be absorbed by the plant. And there, on most of the soils on the planet, you will find phosphate in plant unavailable forms. Very little is being done by the farmers in farm management to mobilize that phosphate. Why? Because phosphate has been delivered to the agricultural systems around the planet at a relatively low cost. But as the cost of phosphate goes up, as the supply of phosphate fails to meet the demand, so supply-demand principles in economics means as the supply becomes less and the demand increases, the price goes up. This will put pressure on the agricultural systems to be more intelligent in how we mobilize plant-available phosphates. One of the strategies is to use microbiology to these so-called phosphorizing microbes to liberate naturally occurring phosphorus that's currently in soluble forms, phosphate forms in soils that you find all over the planet. This is going to be a very interesting development in the future of agriculture. The agricultural industries will invest money in this. It will be very interesting to see how this applied biology will come to replace the industry of mineral and chemically treated phosphate rock as a supply of phosphorus in the production of crops around the planet. Next slide. Phosphate, in chemistry, a phosphate is an anion. This is a positively charged ion. It's a salt. It's a mineral salt. It is in a functional group or an ester derived from a phosphoric acid. It most commonly means orthophosphate, and it is orthophosphate that plants absorb. Next slide. Orthophosphates are especially important among the various phosphates because of their key roles in biochemistry, biogeochemistry, and ecology, and their economic importance for agriculture and industry. Orthophosphates are plant available forms of phosphorus. They contain the phosphorus that enters the plant. Okay, next slide. Now let's look at the phosphate molecule. The chemical structure is that of a tetrahedron. 4 phosphates sitting on the top, 3 at the bottom. The structure, when you examine it from a molecular structure point of view, it is interesting to discover that it's in the shape of a tetrahedron. Next slide. The phosphorus cycle. The cycling of phosphorus through the environment involves 3 interlocking subcycles: the inorganic cycle, land-based biological cycle, and water-based biological cycle. Next slide. The inorganic cycle takes millions of years. So all of 3 of these cycles will be given a reference to time. The inorganic cycle is a cycling of phosphorus that takes millions of years. Okay. Phosphate rock on our planet was formed when Earth's lithosphere solidified. This is basically the beginning of our planet. And the particulates in the atmosphere begin to solidify. The particulates that were in this area of the solar system where our Earth is located, and lithosphere is the outer part of our atmosphere. As these particulates solidify to create what we think of today as the planet, inherent in the mineralogies that were solidified was phosphate rock. Additionally, meteorites contribute. 100 metric tons of meteorite matter enters the Earth's atmosphere daily, which is typically 0.1% phosphorus. The most important components of phosphate rock are nearly insoluble phosphate salts. So this is what you find in the mines. This is what you find terrestrial phosphates when you're dealing with the mines, a lot of insoluble phosphate rocks. Weathering leaches phosphates from the soil and carries the ions through rivers to the sea. Phosphate deposits formed on the ocean shelves around the planet. The ocean shelves are near the land areas. So as the rivers deliver the phosphate deposits, these ions into the ocean, it lands on the ocean shelves mostly. This is going around the planet. This same thing is happening. And with the geologic shifts, the tectonic shifts, the Earth's plates, when they're pushed back to the surface, these become deposits of phosphates on the land. Next slide. Now we're going to move to land-based biological cycles. This is the phosphorus cycle that involves biology. This is the interface of the mineralogy of phosphates and phosphorus with biological systems on the planet. In this case, with reference to time, it takes years for these cycles to take place. These are the land-based cycles. It involves the incorporation of phosphorus into biological organisms, biological molecules, bones, teeth, etc. And ultimately, the release through excretion and decomposition of those biological organisms. Plants remove phosphates from the inorganic cycle. Plants excrete acids. This is a very intelligent thing for the plants to do. Plants excrete acids to break up insoluble forms of phosphates. This is now we're talking about plants growing in a soil anywhere on the planet. So the plants have a way using biochemistries, in this case acids. They excrete them from the roots. These acids go into the soil profile. There they find these insoluble phosphate rocks, and these acids begin to break the bonds that hold these phosphate rock molecules together. And as they reduce these molecules to more and more simple forms, ultimately they liberate water-soluble forms of phosphate, which ultimately can be used by the plants. Animals that eat the plants excrete soluble phosphate, which is also then used by newly growing plants. Biology moves phosphates from the lithosphere to the hydrosphere, hydrosphere being the the liquid part of our planet, the oceans, the rivers, the lakes, and the soil water. Next slide. Now we're going to talk about the cycling of phosphorus in water systems. In this case, with reference to time, it's observed that this cycle only requires some weeks to just a few years. Algae in aquatic systems take up phosphorus that enters the hydrosphere. Hydrosphere is just the water system in the atmospheric environment of our planet, enters the hydrosphere of the planet. Okay. Animals eat the algal forms. These are aquatic animals, mostly. There are some terrestrial animals who eat aquatic algal forms as well, like a moose in Canada. And these large animals eat the smaller animals. Big fish eats the little fish. With continuous excretion of phosphate, also the animals die and they go through decomposition. Some aquatic animals become deposits on terrestrial environments. The fish are removed from the ocean and the remains of the fish are integrated with the terrestrial environment. Some of the phosphate in the aquatic environment sink to the bottom and join the long-term mineral deposits of the inorganic cycle. So these complex, insoluble mineral deposits that we have mentioned forming on the bottom of the hydrosphere, the water systems of the planet, these deposits, they represent the inorganic cycle. That's where the inorganic cycle largely exists. And the inorganic cycle takes millions of years for the phosphorus to cycle. But so you see here from the water-based biological cycle, phosphates are being mobilized. They're moving through the aquatic, animal, and plant world. And ultimately, a certain fraction of them end up being returned to that insoluble mineral fraction at the bottom of aquatic systems. Okay, so this is a broad description of the cycling of phosphorus on land biological systems, water biological systems, and the inorganic cycle, all being given a reference with respect to the time it takes for the phosphorus to cycle through those systems. Next slide. Here's a graphic that is an oversimplification, but it begins to give you a feel for some of this information graphically by picture. You'll see the mountains on the left. The mountains have been pushed up from geological uplift. These are the tectonic plates that push up our mountains. And in these mountains, you'll find these inorganic deposits that come from the bottom of the ocean that ultimately end up in a mountain. And then these deposits of phosphates in the mountains are the ions in those deposits are leached and returned to the ocean. So this is like a cycle in and of itself. And then those ions may fall to the bottom of the ocean or riverbed, and the process starts over again. Also in agriculture, you have a certain amount of phosphates that are water soluble that end up moving through the rivers and the creeks and find their way into the oceans also. And then those phosphates contribute to the inorganic cycle, which is represented largely at the bottom of the ocean. And on the right-hand side, you'll see a circle represented here with plants, which absorb phosphorus from the soil. Animals eat the plants. Animals then die. They're decomposed by microbiology, fungi, bacteria. And then you have plants that die, and they're decomposed by bacteria and fungi and other biologies. And ultimately, this is a cycling process. Then the plants take up the phosphorus again, and the whole process starts over again. Next slide. This is another view of the same thing. On the left-hand side, you'll see this cycle of animals and plants and the decomposers. You'll see here, in this case, phosphates represented underground in the soil. You'll see phosphates in mountains that's being weathered. And then you see phosphate deposits at the bottom of the ocean. One thing to note in this graphic is that you do not see phosphates so much in the air. Okay? So you have inorganic forms of phosphates, largely found as deposits in mountains, contributed from the formation of the planet originally, plus meteorites that are continuously bringing phosphorus into our atmosphere. So let's go on to the next slide. Farmers manage phosphorus. This is a macronutrient. It's part of the NPK fertilizer or plant food formulation. Nitrogen is good for the green growth of plants. Phosphorus is largely utilized in plant physiology related to flower formation, fruit formation, and root growth. Potassium addresses the overall health and growth of the cells of a plant. Next slide. Phosphorus as a fertilizer for plants. The fertilizer form of phosphorus is called phosphorus pentoxide, P2O5. You'll see on the right-hand side there a graphic presentation of the phosphorus pentoxide molecule. You'll see two phosphorus elements, atoms. You'll see 5 oxygen atoms. This is P2O5, and that's the structure of the molecule. The phosphorus in NPK is actually represented as the percent of P2O5. But this is the tricky part. Plants don't actually take up this form meaning P2O5. On the other hand, what really happens is P2O5 reacts with water. Now, this is a reaction that may occur in the soil, for example, because most soils on average, ideally, typically are about 25% water. Now, that goes up and down depending on the weather and the locality, the soil type, all these factors. But generally speaking, an ideal soil is about 25% water. So when you deliver P2O5 to a soil, it interacts with the water in the soil to form orthophosphates, H2PO4, HPO4. The final bullet point here, this is a point that's made from a laboratory. Tri-State is a laboratory. Phosphorus recommendations are in P2O5. So this is the main point there, is when you get a lab recommendation for the amount of P or phosphorus that you should be delivering to your crop, the lab will give you the report in the amount of P2O5 that you need to deliver to the field. Next slide. This is a very interesting graphic. Let's start in the middle in the golden box where it says soil solution P, phosphorus. These are the two molecules that are orthophosphates. And these are the two forms of phosphorus that a plant will utilize. They're water soluble. They're part of the soil solution. That means they're in solution in the soil water. Because they are soluble, they can be leached into the groundwater. Plants can take them up. Also, because they're water soluble, they can be moved from your field by water erosion into the rivers and the creeks and ultimately into the ocean. You know, this point that I'm making here about these orthophosphates. If the orthophosphates are in excess in your field, it's quite realistic. You should know this fact that these orthophosphates can be removed from your field because of water erosion. Managing erosion is important in protecting and keeping plant foods, nutrients in your field and not in the rivers, not in the streams, and not in the ocean. You know, in the United States, we have a big problem with this because the broad distribution of phosphates as a fertilizer and the excessive amounts of the orthophosphate forms that are delivered in conventional modern agricultural production, many of these orthophosphates find their way into the rivers and streams and ultimately into the Gulf of Mexico in the United States. The Mississippi River delivers them there. The Mississippi River drainage basin covers about 50% of the United States. So that means that all water, all creeks, all rivers in the United States, in about 50% of the United States, those waters are ultimately find their way to the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi River deposits its water into the Gulf of Mexico. And we have major orthophosphate problems in the Gulf of Mexico, stimulating algal blooms, which creates toxic environments for marine life. It's not a good thing. So let's come back now to our soil in our field, these orthophosphates, and how do these orthophosphates, where do they come from? Okay, on the right-hand side, you'll see three triangle boxes there, are rectangular boxes. The bottom two are the mineral forms of phosphorus. So you have at the bottom apatite, which is the geological form of rock, which contains the phosphates. And within the phosphates, you'll have the phosphorus element. The next is secondary phosphorus minerals, which are calcium phosphates, iron, aluminum phosphates. And at the top, sorbed phosphorus, they're clay minerals where iron oxides, aluminum oxides that have attached to them the phosphorus molecules, phosphate. Through the process called desorption, you'll see the green arrow. This is a chemical process that takes place in the soil. The phosphorus is liberated, converted, reduced to orthophosphates. Secondary P minerals, through a process called dissolution, Same thing happens. It is reduced. These molecules are reduced, and orthophosphate is the result, which enters the soil solution. And even apatite, the original geology that contains the phosphates, through weathering processes, will also liberate and reduce the forms of the phosphate to a form which becomes ultimately an orthophosphate, which is plant available. On the left-hand side, through the process called mineralization, here you have organic forms of phosphate. So this is where phosphorus is embedded into molecular forms, molecules, the chemistry of that is what we would call organic chemistries in the soil. So it may be part of the organic matter. It may be part of the biology of a microbe. It's part of the soil biomass, which is living. These are plants that are living there, worms that are living there, all of the animal life and all of the plant life in the soil, whether it's dead or alive, contains phosphorus. Through a process of mineralization, this organic matter is reduced, broken down. The bonds are broken within those molecules, ultimately liberating phosphorus into a form of orthophosphates, which are plant available. So this is, if you want to know about agriculture and phosphorus, this graphic does a really good job laying out that picture. Next slide. So this is the game plan. How are we get phosphorus, this element, from the periodic table to the plants? This is part of farm management. Next slide. Phosphorus is a key nutrient in mineral and organic fertilizers, both of them. Next slide. So just to mention a little bit about the formula of fertilizers for macronutrients in PK. The nitrogen, you should think of it as something that mostly goes upward in the plant, fueling the top growth of the plant. Phosphorus is a rock, and you should think of it mostly as being moved into the root system of the plant. But through translocation, it's also then relocated to the leaf areas of the plant to support bloom, fruit set, as well as energy transfer from the photosynthetic process. Potassium promotes all-around well-being, and it moves equally upward and downward in the plant. Next slide. So a little bit more about fertilizers. Fertilizers containing one nutrient element are called straight fertilizers. And those with a combination of two or more are compound fertilizers. So in the text at the bottom, you'll see on the left-hand side, inorganic fertilizers. And in this case, an inorganic fertilizer is often called a chemical fertilizer. And a straight fertilizer might be, for example, urea by itself, or superphosphate, which is phosphate rock that's treated with acids like phosphoric acid, or potassium chloride, which is a potassium salt. Okay, if those appear singularly, like if urea is by itself, it may be registered or reported as 4600. Or if it's superphosphate, it might be 0420. If it's potassium chloride, then the K, potassium being represented by the letter K, it might be 0030. Okay, something like that. So, but when they appear as individuals, it's called a straight fertilizer. When it's mixed and you put them in combinations, it's then a compound fertilizer. On the right-hand side, you see organic fertilizers. These organic fertilizers are virtually always compound fertilizers. They're in combination. So you have many examples of that. Fish meal, bone meal, green manures of different kinds. You can have alfalfa meal, blood, fish meal, as mentioned. You can have the waste from cows, pigs, chickens, dairy cows, rabbits, all kinds of animals. And you can even have soybean meal or neem cake or garlic meal. All of these things ultimately fall under the category of organic fertilizers, and they're all compound fertilizers. Next slide. How do we deliver phosphates to the field? There are many methods. Here you see the distribution of a granular fertilizer with a spreader in a large field. For example, this is what we see on a regular basis in the state of Iowa, where we live in the United States. Very common scene in the fields. This looks like my neighbor's field. It's not, but it looks like my neighbor's field. I own a farm in our local area here in Iowa, about 50 acres. I don't really farm like this. We have horses on our farm, so it's grass and such. But in this case, all of our neighbors growing corn and soybeans, this is how they deliver the phosphate to those fields. Next slide. Or you might deliver the phosphates like this, by hand, depending on the agronomic system, the farm management system that you're dealing with. It can be highly industrial, or it can be more like village agriculture. Next slide. This is out of Japan, I think, and it's a very unique delivery mechanism. They're delivering liquid forms of phosphate to pots with these devices where they have a trigger and they can inject the liquid directly into the pots. So there's a lot of pot agriculture in the world. For example, in the state of Florida, the production of ornamental plants is a major industry, generating about $2 billion US dollars of revenue for farms that grow ornamental plants, mostly in pots. And there are hundreds and hundreds of these farms in the state of Florida in the United States. This is an example of what they look like. Next slide. Many of you have seen this method of delivery. In this case, we're looking at the lawn around your house, at the hose-in applicator delivering a liquid fertilizer. Next slide. Another way of delivering a liquid fertilizer, in this case, it's foliar feeding liquid forms of phosphates, phosphorus. That's either soluble orthophosphates that are being delivered as foliar feeds and also being delivered to the soil, which rainfall will push down into the soil, because the orthophosphates in a liquid form are water soluble. Therefore, they will infiltrate with rainwater. So you can deliver phosphates in a liquid form like this. Next slide. And here's another method for delivering those liquid orthophosphates to the field. Airplanes. We are part of an industry where we supply microbiology, actually, from our location in Iowa, from our company, Soil Technologies, into Central America. And these microbiologies are delivered by airplane on thousands and thousands of hectares of rice. The microbiologies serve many agronomic functions on the rice plant. We also deliver botanical-based organic pesticides for that rice production. to control insects on that rice. So aerial application, something that's very common around the world, especially in North America, Central America, and South America. We see these airplanes delivering these technologies to the field. Next slide. Video clip here. Okay, I will mention to you something about that video clip and the different sources of phosphorus. And they mentioned that phosphate rock is mined, treated with acids to liberate the water-soluble forms of phosphate. And in this case, in organic agriculture, phosphate rock is ground up into a powder or very small granular forms and is delivered to the fields without being treated with acids. So in conventional agriculture, most of the phosphates are delivered to the field after being treated with acids, which increases the percentage of water available phosphates. On the other hand, organic agriculture does not allow that form of phosphorus to be used in organic crop production. Therefore, an organic farmer will use rock phosphate and will purchase rock phosphate for delivery to their fields without it being treated with acids. It takes longer to break down, but it does increase the amount of water-soluble phosphates, the orthophosphates, in the soil solution, supporting plant growth. It's just that the delivery of those orthophosphate is a slower process when you use rock phosphates directly to the field compared to using things like triple superphosphate, which is phosphate rock that's been treated with acids. Okay, now we're going to move on to the carbon cycle. In the case of the carbon cycle, we're dealing with an element from the periodic table. Here you see a picture of it. And this element is probably one of the most important elements in chemistry. in, in all of the applied aspects of chemistry and industry, with respect to agricultural industries, with respect to the environment, our atmosphere. This element is probably the most important element in the periodic table with respect to life on this planet. It influences our life in many, many different ways. Next slide. Carbon comes from the Latin word carbo, or coal. It's a chemical element with the symbol C and atomic number 6. It is non-metallic and tetravalent, making 4 electrons available to form covalent chemical bonds. And that's a very important line for you to remember. So it's non-metallic, it's tetravalent, which means it has 4 electrons available to form covalent chemical bonds. This is a very important part of the importance of carbon as an element in molecular structures. It belongs to the group 14 of the periodic table. Carbon makes up only 0.025% of the Earth's crust. It's pretty incredible, the importance of carbon in the life and the geology of our planet. Yet it really only represents 0.025% of the Earth's crust. This tells you how reactive carbon is, how efficient it is in its participation in molecular structures. Let's go on to the next slide. Carbon is the most important element to life. Without this element, life as we know it would not exist. Carbon is the central element in compounds necessary for life. Next slide. In combinations, carbon is found in all living things. That means that it's an important component of the chemistry of all living things. The chemistry of living things is the physiology of those living forms. It is also found in fossilized remains in the form of hydrocarbons, like natural gas, crude oil shales, coal, as well in carbonates like chalk, limestone, dolomite. Next slide. Organic chemistry. So chemistry basically is broken down into 2 fields of study: inorganic chemistry and organic chemistry. A lot of what we have been discussing in this course up to this point would fall mostly in the field of inorganic chemistry. Organic chemistry is a field of study that is a focus on carbon compounds. Carbon is singled out because it has a chemical diversity unrivaled by any other chemical element. So when we say any other chemical element, we're talking about any other chemical element on the periodic table. Carbon atoms bond reasonably strongly with other carbon atoms. Carbon atoms bond reasonably strongly with atoms of other elements. Carbon is very unique in this regard, unrivaled, capable of creating a vast chemical diversity of molecules. Therefore, it is a specialized area of chemical study called organic chemistry. And an organic molecule always contains carbon. Later this year, in what will be the fall of the year for us, probably starting in September, we plan to offer a course where we look at organic chemistry in agriculture. So our first course is called Chemistry in Agriculture. The second course will be more specialized, and it will be called Organic Chemistry in Agriculture. You'll hear more about that from Kelly in the near term. Next slide. So organic chemistry, at the top of this graphic, to the left is the chemistry of carbon compounds. To the right, it includes the elements of biochemistry, which focuses on key areas like, for example, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids. This is the world of biochemistries. That gives you a hint as to what we might be discussing in the next course that we teach called Organic Chemistry in Agriculture. We'll be focusing more on the biochemistries of agriculture, the formations of all of these kind of structures, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids as examples, and where they show up in agriculture, what it means to manage them, what it means to deliver those organic chemistries to animals, and how these chemistries migrate through the environment, through the organic biological systems on the planet. Next slide. The carbon cycle itself is the biogeochemical cycle. So this is a cyclical exercise by which carbon is exchanged among the biosphere, the pedosphere, the geosphere, the hydrosphere, and the atmosphere of the Earth. So this means pretty much a movement of carbon everywhere through our planet. And this is the carbon cycle. Next slide. The carbon cycle, this is a series of processes or reactions or chemical events by which carbon compounds, so this is carbon mixed with other elements, carbon compounds are interconverted in the environment. So they're converted from one form to another. The carbon is always moving between these molecules, involving the incorporation of carbon dioxide into living tissue by photosynthesis. Now we're talking about a plant. And it's returned to the atmosphere through respiration, the decay of dead organisms, and ultimately the burning of fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are historically plants that were alive, died, and accumulated as fossil fuels in the Earth's environment. Next slide. Oh, let's look at this one for a second. The carbon cycle. In this illustration, you see the plant, you see photosynthesis, and you see the movement back and forth from the plant to the atmosphere for CO2. Respiration takes place. Carbon in the plant may be consumed by the animal. It may be decomposed into the earth. Some of that carbon may go down and become part of the fossil fuel, the fossils on the planet. So coal, hydrocarbon, these are basically plant fossils. Fossil fuels can be burned to produce electricity, for example, which delivers CO2 back to the atmosphere. So this is the carbon cycle. A somewhat simple representation, but you can see the point that carbon is moving through all of these environments, changing molecular forms, but moving through all of these environments. And this is the cyclical movement of carbon. Next slide. Humans and the carbon cycle. Humans have disturbed the biological carbon cycle for many centuries by modifying land use. This is agriculture mostly. And moreover, with the recent industrial scale mining of fossil carbon, coal, petroleum, gas extraction, cement manufacturing, which is extracted from the geosphere, the geology of the planet. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere had increased nearly 52% over pre-industrial levels in 2020. So pre-industrial levels, when we were not the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere before we were more of an industrial economy on our planet, when we were more of an agrarian economy on our planet. As we shifted into more of an industrial economy for our planet, the accumulation of carbon dioxide increased, and it's gone up by 52% from the pre-industrial period to the point of 2020, forcing greater atmospheric and earth surface heating by the sun. So this is the greenhouse effect. The increased carbon dioxide has also increased the acidity of the ocean surface by about 30% due to dissolved carbon dioxide, carbonic acid, and other compounds, and is fundamentally altering marine chemistry, the chemistry of the oceans. The majority of fossil carbon has been extracted over just the past half century, the past 50 years. So since we've been harvesting fossilized carbon from the earth, the majority of that work, the majority of that extraction has taken place over the last 50 years. And the rate of extraction continues to increase. It's rising rapidly, which fuels the process of human contribution to climate change. The combustion of these fossil fuels delivers CO2 into the atmosphere and other molecular structures that are carbon-based that are causing the climate to change. This is the human influence to our planet, and it's part of the carbon cycle. Next slide. This graphic is an attempt to present the actual measurement in gigatons of carbon per year that are delivered to the atmosphere, especially the atmosphere, as well as to the oceans and to the soil. But especially important here is the delivery to the atmosphere. And the text that you see here in red represents what is called the human contribution of emissions, our carbon-based molecules that are fed and fueled into the atmosphere of the earth. And each number represents a gigaton of carbon per year, a very large amount. Let's go to the next slide. To offset greenhouse gas emissions, we need to do that. Farmers play a role in this. Farmers can, they do, they have an obligation. They're responsible to the planet. They're responsible to our humanity and all of life on the planet with respect to carbon, or we'll call it greenhouse gas emissions, the carbon cycle. Farmers are an intricate part of that cycle. And the farmers have the potential to play a very positive role with respect to this movement or the cycling of carbon in the carbon cycle on the planet. Okay, so here's the text. To offset greenhouse gas emissions and reduce atmospheric CO2, carbon can be trapped in soils through various carbon sink activities, such as the growth of trees, forestry management that reduces forest fires, forest degradation, increasing below ground plant matter, and sequestering carbon in soils through cropland, wetland, or grassland management. This whole concept of carbon management is now becoming a very large component in agricultural management all over the planet. Let's go to the next slide. Carbon sequestration. This is the trick. What does this mean? It simply means that we're taking the carbon out of the atmosphere and we are stabilizing it in molecular forms in soils. And the fancy word for that process is sequestration, carbon sequestration. Next slide. Okay, I have been an agronomist for almost 50 years. And in all of my 50 years, managing, being involved with, supervising, making recommendations, direct supervision of farm operations, the best method that I have found for improving soils is what's called a green manure. So this is, as you can see in this picture, it is the delivery of growing plants in a vegetative form directly into the soil to improve many characteristics of a soil profile, whether it be chemical characteristics or physical characteristics. The best method that I have found over all of my years is the incorporation of plants or green manure into a soil profile. Next slide. What does this look like on the farm? This implement is a tandem disc. And you see the weights on the top of the disc. And in this case, they're disking or incorporating the green material directly into the soil. And you can incorporate at different depths. You can adjust the tandem at different angles. That's the angle of the disc blades that are going through the soil to turn the soil more or to turn the soil less. Go to the next slide. Now, this is an example of what's called a moldboard plow, a four-bottom, four-unit moldboard plow pulled by a four-wheel drive, relatively small John Deere tractor. So this would be a modest, medium-sized farm operation. And you can see what they're doing. The moldboard plow turns the soil over and buries the green material into the soil where it will break down. You should know agronomically, after you incorporate green material of this nature into your soils, ideally you wait about 6 weeks before you plant into that field, because the breakdown of the green manure in the soil will produce biochemistries that are a little bit toxic to the germinating seed that you put into the field. So normally the recommendation is to wait about 6 weeks, give time for the green manure to break down, and then you can go in and safely plant your seeds, corn, soybeans, wheat, beans, any crop that you might want to plant. You wait a little while, give Mother Nature a chance to process what you've delivered to it. The soil is a living body. It needs a little time to adjust to this delivery of all of this organic material and to reduce that organic material aggressively. And once it takes about 6 weeks for that process before you're really ready to plant. Next slide. Another method for getting carbon into the soil is intercropping. In this case, this means you're planting 2 crops. It could be 3 crops, it could be 4 crops, depending on where you're located on the planet. People utilize different numbers of crops in an intercropping farm management strategy. In this case, you'll see a legume, looks like red clovers, and corn. Looks like 2 types of legumes planted there. In any case, after the corn is harvested, the legume is incorporated into the soil. So you're growing a cash grain crop and a soil improvement crop simultaneously. That's intercropping. Next slide. Another concept for what is more or less the same thing is called cover crops. So in this case, the corn has been harvested. Now the field is open. It's going to go through an off season. And farm management practice that's highly recommended in agronomy is to utilize a cover crop, which means you might sow a grass there. It could be a ryegrass, whatever grass is appropriate for your location. And that grass serves many functions, many agronomic functions in that field. It helps control erosion during the off season when the cash crop is not being grown. It will eventually become a green manure when it's plowed down. It is also a way to continuously, while it is growing vegetatively, to continuously take CO2 out of the atmosphere and deliver it into the soil. So it may be winter wheat that you're growing, it may be ryegrass that you're growing. There are many ways of creating a cover crop environment to complement a grain crop or legume crop or any other crop that would functionally remove carbon from the atmosphere so that the farmer is engaged in the process of what we call carbon farming or carbon sequestration. This is becoming a bigger, larger, very important part of agricultural management around the planet today. Next slide. So let's look at this one. At the top, this is a graphic suggesting climate smart agriculture management practices. This is a sort of a buzzword today in the evolution of agricultural practices as well as policy in governments. What does it mean to farm, to manage in agriculture in such a way that it is climate smart? So this is our goal. We want agriculture around the planet to become more climate smart. And hopefully this course that you are all taking is leaving you with a number of suggestions as to how agriculture might be practiced in your local area in a more intelligent, in a more climate smart way. At the bottom of this graphic, you see the SOC, soil organic carbon. This is the big focus today. In farm management, our goal is to increase the SOC. You're going to hear more and more about SOC, soil organic carbon. It's part of the laboratory analytical exercises for soil analysis. Most labs now will report on the SOC, and you'll hear about it at universities. They'll teach about SOC, what it means to the environment, what it means to agricultural practices. There are many ways to increase soil organic carbon. Here you see cover crops, conservation tillage, and biochar. Biochar is basically if you take organic matter, like it could be wood, It could be corn stalks. It could be any kind of organic matter. And you combust that following certain procedures. You produce a product that's called biochar, which is very high in carbon. And that can actually be incorporated into your soil as a soil amendment. Let's go to the next slide. This needs to be paid for. This is not going to be free. Managing the carbon cycle on the planet costs money. You know, there's the contribution of these carbon molecules in the atmosphere from airplanes, from automobiles, from agricultural practices, from producing of electricity, from manufacturing, industrial operations, trucks, tractors. Obviously, from the data tells us that we need to do something about this. In order to exercise that work, to do something about this carbon in the atmosphere, money is involved. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the money and the potential for compensating farmers as carbon farmers. Compensate the farmer for agricultural practices that are of value to our environment in the form of carbon sequestrations. Next slide. So plants, obviously, are taking CO2 out of the atmosphere to fuel a photosynthetic process to produce carbohydrates. Organic matter from the plants break down sugars from the plant, feed the microbial life in the plant. And at the bottom, the text at the bottom of this graphic, these leaked carbon-rich sugars from organic matter combine with decomposed stems, roots, leaves to form humus. So all of the organic matter contributions to the soil, as they decompose at a certain rate. Now we're going to define for you what humus is from the point of view of organic matter decomposition. All organic matter that goes into a soil goes through a decomposition process. So all of the carbon that's been captured by the plant from the atmosphere is ultimately reduced to a decomposition exercise in the soil. Most all of the organic material. Some of it may be removed from the field as corn or grain or fruits or vegetables. But a large part of the plant material that you grow on a farm ends up being incorporated back into the soil. The decomposition rate is at different rates of aggressive chemical changes. The raw organic matter, when the microbes attack that, the bacteria, the fungi in the soil attack that raw organic matter, the rate of decomposition, which is the rate of reducing and breaking the bonds that hold the molecules together in the organic matter, that rate is most rapid at the early stage of organic matter decomposition. As that decomposition process reduces the organic matter, it reaches a point where the rate of decomposition has slowed down dramatically. And at that point, organic matter begins to take on the form that we classically call humus. And in the case of humus, you're dealing with a chemistry, as stated here, which has stable forms of organic carbon that can stay in the underground for centuries. So this, what I have just described to you, is the mechanism in the soil which is carbon sequestration. The sequestration of carbon, the capture of carbon in molecular forms that make up humus in the soil. It is at that point that you've captured the carbon in a form that is likely to stay in that form for a very long period of time. This is what we want the farmers to do more of. We want them to invest themselves. We want society to help them expand and modify, expand the practices that best support the formation of humus in the soil profile, because that's where you get the capture of carbon in stable organic carbon molecules that stay in the underground for centuries. Next slide. So there's money involved. We have to pay the farmers. How are we going to do that? It's an interesting point that the accumulation of CO2 in the atmosphere and other carbon-based molecules in the atmosphere, all of society, all of the people on the whole planet have been making contribution to this. Some are more aggressive contributors, some are less aggressive contributors. Developed countries are the highest polluters. They are contributing more of the carbon in the atmosphere than the less developed economies on the planet. But all of societies, all countries, all people on the planet are contributing to this problem. So it's financially not solely the responsibility of a farmer to finance this process. It's really the financial responsibility of everybody. And that will be the next few points. Next slide. Carbon farming is here. This is a real thing. This is being discussed at all levels of governments all over the world today, especially in the ministries of agriculture. In November 2020, a group of over 150 former government officials and advisors to President Biden, the current president of the United States, and he was elected in November of 2020, they published a list of recommendations meant to help the administration of President Biden hit the ground running on the climate crisis. Foremost among the suggested agricultural proposals was the creation of a federal carbon bank, which would pay producers, farmers, to adopt conservation practices such as cover cropping and no-till farming on their fields, because we know that these practices involve delivering organic matter to the farm soils, which then in turn is evolved through decomposition into humus chemistry, which is made up of stable molecules that last for a really long time in the field. So this is a carbon bank to pay for carbon sequestration, direct payments to the farm to compensate them for investing their farm management efforts in practices that sequester carbon. Next slide. So the carbon bank, this is something that all people all over the planet needs to support. Next slide. A carbon bank works by providing financing and funding for green initiatives and climate-friendly practices. A number of smaller carbon bank and carbon pricing systems exist already in the United States. However, they're generally limited in scope and consistency. These are mostly private systems of carbon sequestration compensation. This is being done by private sectors, where private monies, not government money, but private money is already being invested directly with farmers to to encourage them and compensate them for climate-friendly farming practices. A national or public carbon bank, however, could help farmers across the country by providing funding, setting market prices, and piloting green initiatives without needing congressional approval for each of their actions. So this simply means that if our government would create a carbon bank would be given funding, then the long-term funding, then the carbon bank would enter the business of measuring carbon sequestration on farms and compensating the farmers for that work. Next slide. One of the leading proposals involves using the USA Commodity Credit Corporation, CCC, to create a carbon bank. The CCC is essentially the USDA's personal financial institute, allowing them, namely the USDA, to spend $30 billion before needing replenishment from Congress. So these are the inner dynamics of a political system in the United States through the Department of Agriculture, the USDA, and they have mechanisms within the USDA that already exist, which could sponsor a carbon bank. And the proposed initial funding would be $30 billion US dollars. This is being discussed now within the government of the United States. A carbon bank could be used to pay farmers a guaranteed price for sequestering carbon as well as greenhouse gas reductions. For example, by allocating $1 billion from the CCC, a carbon bank could pay guaranteed carbon credits to farmers for every ton of greenhouse emissions they reduce. So this is basically a measurement of carbon in tons that would be determined by the government as a measurement against the farm and the farm's practices. And this may involve soil analysis, for example, looking at the COC, the amount of soil organic carbon. And if that, as the soil organic carbon changes based on soil analysis, it's easy to compute the tonnage of carbon that's added to the soil from the farmer's practices on a per acre basis. And the government, the people's money, taxpayers' money, would be used in the case of this national carbon bank to pay those farmers for increasing the soil organic carbon, the SOC, in their fields. And they would be paid by the ton of carbon that they deliver and they capture in their fields. Next slide. There are many carbon bank initiatives around the world. Here's one in Australia. Next slide. Here's another one. This is the logo of another carbon bank. I think this one is in Europe, possibly Spain. Here's another one. Next slide. I think this one might be in Brazil, possibly. Next slide. The World Carbon Bank. This is an initiative that is on its way, and there are many examples like this. This is happening all over the world. And wherever you are located, it would be important for your government to be thinking to do the same thing. It should be encouraged in agriculture today. And it's another source of income for farmers. So you grow the grain, you plant the crop, you follow practices that sequester carbon, you get paid for the grain, you get paid for the biomass, whether it's a food, a feed, or a fiber that you're producing. And And at the same time, you're paid for carbon farming, for capturing carbon. We're doing it anyway. It's happening on farms. We want to encourage those farming practices that accelerate and expand the carbon capture process. Next slide. Even the climate agreements, in this case, we're referring to the Kyoto Protocol. Carbon banking is profiled in all of the climate agreements that many of the countries around the world are participants in. We are collaborators on these climate agreements all over the planet, involving most all of the countries of the world. And integral to those climate agreements is the concept of carbon banking. It's a concept that's emerging. It's a financial concept, and it includes compensating farmers for the sequestration of carbon. Next slide. So keep your eyes out for the future carbon bank in your community. And we encourage anyone and everyone involved in agriculture today to invest yourself in carbon farming. And hopefully the society that you live in will grow and evolve to recognize the importance of using public money, the money that belongs to all people, and let's have all people help finance carbon farming, the sequestration of carbon through carbon banks to benefit the agricultural community, to compensate them, and to encourage them to sequester carbon. Next slide. So we want to thank you for participation in this class today and in the course. This is our last session for this course. And Kelly will be sending you updates on the YouTube posting of all of the classes. She'll send you directly the recording of this session. She may also send you directly the PowerPoint as a separate document as well. Okay, thank you all very much. We hope that you enjoy the rest of 2021. Looking forward to working with all of you again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to take a quick, let's just take a quick look at the chat section here to make sure that we're covering everybody there. Can you bring up the chat? I can probably do that here. Yes. So the chat session. The email address for. See credit in the chat, sure. Well, Kelly will deal with all the credits, and you can communicate with her about that. And she'll send a credit to anybody that would like to get a certificate. She'll send a certificate to anybody that would like to get one. What will happen if you add zinc to phosphate? And Dr. Winu has responded to that. Research shows that high rates of phosphorus fertilizer without adequate plant available zinc can reduce zinc uptake by the roots and induce zinc deficiency. When making decisions for soil fertility program, it's important to consider some of the factors and situations that may cause phosphorus zinc antagonism and how to best avoid and minimize those factors. Well, you know, we have presented N, P, and K in our classes in this course in a relatively simplistic way. There are a lot of interactions between the elements that are both macro, essential, and micro elements for plants in a field. And to focus more thoroughly on these interactions will probably require a separate type of course. And we may do that at some point. It may be a future course for us. But let's just encourage everybody as they focus on N, P, and K, the essential elements and the microelements. As you make decisions about these elements in farm management, you should take the time to study some of the interactions between these elements. Some are complementary and some are not complementary. And you need to know how to utilize, you need this body of knowledge to know how to best utilize or to execute best management practices with regard to plant nutrition. So we encourage you to study that at a deeper level so that you might find, for example, here there's the references to the interrelationship between zinc and phosphates. There are actually many interrelationships between the elements and the various forms of the elements that we might consider in crop management. So in an alkali soil, a calcium-rich soil, what is the best way to deliver phosphorus? I know in conventional agriculture, the most common way that this takes place is by direct spraying liquid phosphoric acid onto soils. That's a very common method. Another way that you might consider doing phosphorus, how to get phosphorus into your crops in a calcium-rich soil, is by foliar feeding orthophosphates directly to the crop through the leaf of the plant. Okay, Kelly, I think we're finished. You want to say something and complete the session today?
No, I think we're all good. Thank you so much, everybody. Again, feel free to send me any kind of emails if you want a certificate or if you have any questions with the continuing ed credits for the ASA. So thank you so much again, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.